Welcome. This is the third and final session of Revelations from the Whirlwind with Rabbi Dr. Tzvi Sinensky. We'll jump right into the class. So, with that, I'll turn this to you, Rabbi Sinensky.
Wonderful, Evie. Thank you so much, and excited to jump in for our third and final class in this series. And I want to thank Drisha for the opportunity to learn together once again, and looking forward to more wonderful learning today. So what I want to do today is we had said that three parts we're going to explore different instances of revelation from the whirlwind. So anytime that we find the term se'ara, we find this reference to a whirlwind, to God's kind of the intensity of God's revelation. Is picking up on, of course, the theme of the upcoming holiday of Shavuot and the theme of revelation at Matan Torah, looking at subsequent instances where God reveals his presence to humanity in one way or another, and what we can kind of glean from that in terms of our understanding of our connection with God in general and the symbolism of the whirlwind in particular. So we started off our journey, we started off our discussion by looking at the first example, that of God's revelation at the whirlwind to Eliyahu. And we said that at first glance, it has to do with the intensity of Eliyahu's own relationship with God. If you recall, we saw that Eliyahu is known as the Kanai, he's known as the religious zealot. We know that on the one hand, he's incredibly successful at effecting certain miracles. So, for example, when he finds himself at Har HaKarmel, when he finds himself engaged in spiritual warfare with the prophets of Baal, so he's able to successfully channel the fire from the heavens, bring it down to effect the Kiddush Hashem, the sanctification of God's name in front of masses of Jewish people, to have the prophets of Baal, the false prophets, ultimately killed for their sins. And that's remarkable. But the very next day, of course, Eliyahu turns around and the people are right back at the same altars, worshiping idolatry. Nothing has changed. She's frustrated. He is exasperated. Eliyahu wants to give up. And so he flees to the desert. God allows him to live, transports him 40 days, 40 nights without eating and drinking in a Moses-like episode, whisks him away to Har Horeb, essentially to Mount Sinai, gives him the revelation there of the notion that God's voice is not found in the lightning and the loud and thunderous, but rather in the kol demama daka, in the silence. And so Eliyahu goes to heaven a few chapters later, and he's going to be succeeded by Elisha. So on one level, in that initial case that we've examined, we see that the se'ara represents the intensity of God's whirlwind, as represent, or God's revelation, as represented also or manifest in his symbols or emissaries here on earth. So Eliyahu himself is a zealot. It's the intensity, the tumultuousness, the tempestuousness that we have seen. And so he goes up to heaven. So that was on one level. And yet we saw that even that initial symbol or example of whirlwind, of revelation via the se'ara, we see as well there's something else that is happening, and that God's presence is being essentially not only symbolized by the intensity of Eliyahu's own personality and his own ascent, but at the same time by the arrival of a new model, by the exchange, essentially. In other words, Eliyahu here, it's true, he's going up in this intense experience heavenward, but at the same time, there's something else that's happening, which is that he is not dying, that he is ascending on high, and he is being replaced. He is being represented, or God is being represented instead by the presence of his student, of his disciple Elisha. We pointed out as well, Eliyahu, right? Elihu, he is my God. On the other hand, Elisha, this is about Yeshua. One about pure spiritual salvation, the other, the new model of leadership here on earth, is that of Yeshua, that is salvation. Eliyahu's miracles all centered around bringing the truth of God's presence to Achav, to Izebel, to the prophets of Baal, to the people at that time, disproving the false prophets, proving the efficacy of the belief in God and his prophecy and his divine revelation message, whereas Elisha is this new model, this new emblem of, with the people, present with them. No longer the tempestuousness of revelation of the Sarah has gone up on high, and we're left with a more humane kind of leadership model for the Jewish people at this difficult and painful time in history. That's the first example. So the Sarah, in a way, is inverted almost. In other words, we think of the intensity of God's presence, but sometimes we need the intensity of God's presence to ascend heavenward in a fiery chariot, in this conflagration, to allow for a more moderate, more accessible version or vision of leadership to emerge. Example number one. Last week we examined the case of Yechezkel. So we recall Ezekiel, Yechezkel. Also, at first glance, it seems like a very intense instance of revelation. And yet we saw that despite the apparent midas hadin, the apparent theme of justice, which seems to be present in much the same way as Eliyahu represents the theme or the characteristic of midas hadin, of strict judgment against God's enemies and on behalf of the Almighty. At the same time here too, we saw a little bit of an inversion. We saw that whereas it would seem at first glance that what we see these angelic figures, this Maaseh Merkavah, the vision of Yechezkel, which he sees on the banks of the Kvar River in Babylon at the time of exile. And despite the fact that the first 24 of the 48 chapters of the book of Ezekiel are dedicated to divine punishment, and only subsequently do we find a gesturing of consolation, much as we find in the book of Yeshayahu. We find first destruction for 39 chapters, and then 27 chapters of consolation. Here it's split more evenly, 24 and 24. But still, in those first 24 chapters, we find exile, we find suffering, we find horrific and terrible sinfulness, and all sorts of symbols that we saw in the case of Yechezkel, of him himself embodying, acting out, signifying the exile, the destruction, the ways in which the Jewish people have been shafted aside and God has abandoned them due to their own fault, due to their own sins. At the same time, we also find in the book of Yechezkel that the Se'ara, that the whirlwind, is turned on its head. In other words, what we would have thought is purely a theme of punishment, is purely a theme of exile, in fact, symbolizes the fact that God's presence remains with the Jewish people even during their time of degradation. We pointed out that in one place in the book of Yechezkel, we find that as the rabbis elaborate, that the divine presence ascends through this chariot in 10 stages, and yet it only goes so far in one sense as Har Hazitim, as the Mount of Olives. Right across, we just celebrated Yom Yerushalayim yesterday. We're thinking about the symbolism of Jerusalem. Even when God's presence is not immediately manifest, it's not too far away. The same place that David ran to and then ultimately returned to when his own leadership, when his monarchy was displaced by his son Absalom. Not only that, not only does the presence of God not go too far, it only goes to the Mount of Olives, to Har Hazitim, right across the way from today's Ir HaAtikah. At the same time, not only is God physically manifest, is he physically present in some way, but also God now begins to reveal himself in exile. Yechezkel, seeing and experiencing the first post-temple era prophecy outside of Israel, and the stunning turn of events, as Chazal, as the rabbis pick up on as well, manifests, it represents, it symbolizes this idea that God travels with the Jewish people in exile. That just as his Merkavah, just as his chariot was initially present in a physical and a spiritual sense in the Beit HaMikdash, and it has been forced out by the Jewish people themselves, even though it's our fault. Nonetheless, God travels with us and begins to reveal himself to our great leaders, to our prophets, in exile as well. And that takes place in a se'ara. It's in a se'ara that God is, as it were, forced out, leaves the presence of the temple, goes to Har Hazitim, but now even travels with Yechezkel to exile as a representation of the idea that Imo Anochi Vitzara, That I am with him, I am with the Jewish people in their suffering. It's not a coincidence, we suggested, that the theme of God being present with the Jewish people in exile is accented perhaps most heavily of all the biblical works in Sefer Yechezkel, in this work in particular. We find the idea, God promises, Va'ahi lahem Mikdash Me'at, a small temple, a miniature temple. The physical temple has been destroyed, but the portable, traveling temples of the Jewish people throughout Babylon, throughout now the diaspora for thousands of years, God is present in them as well. And so it's not a coincidence that God's presence has now traveled, has been transported. Yet again, the Se'ara, yes, on its own, shorn of biblical context, without any other ways to interpret its significance, simply represents divine justice. But in both cases, what we see is that in fact, it represents God abandoning or leaving with a certain degree of divine justice to make way for a certain presence with the Jewish people, a certain compassion, a certain humaneness, whether in the symbol of the more compassionate, more accessible model of the leadership of Elisha, or in the case of Yechezkel, as now emblematic of the journey of the Jewish people and therefore of the Shekhinah as well with them from Jerusalem, along with the Jewish people in exile as well. So the question now comes, what do we make of the theme of this Se'ara in the most painful, the most difficult, the most traumatic, perhaps, arguably, certainly on an individual level, of the books of the Bible? And of course, here we come to Sefer Iyyov. If there is one symbol of suffering throughout Tanakh, if there is one person who has experienced the most trauma, the most difficulty, not just physically, but psychologically racked with confusion, with perplexity, a righteous person who loses everything that he ever had under extremely unusual circumstances, to say the very least, it is, of course, the model of Iyyov. So what I want to examine today is God's appearance to Iyyov toward the very end of his book, as we find it, toward the very end of his book. Now, in order to understand the significance of God's revelation to Iyyov, which somehow seems to resolve the book to some degree, such that Iyyov, who has been tortured, who's been confused, who's been debating with his friends throughout the course of the entire book, now, after God reveals himself in the Se'ara, in the whirlwind, somehow out of the whirlwind, Iyyov is able to find peace once again. The question arises, how exactly did that come to be? What here is the symbolism of this Se'ara? If it paradoxically symbolized both divine justice, both the intensity of the divine presence, but also moving away and allowing space for a new model of a more compassionate, humane, accessible leadership or representation of the divine presence here on earth in the cases of Eliyahu and Yechezkel, respectively. The question is, do we see a similar theme here in the case of Iyyov, and if so, how? Not only that, but as we'll see, when God reveals himself in the book of Iyyov, it is with intensity. It is seemingly overwhelming. It is, as I say, minas se'ara. And so in the back of our minds, let's have in mind this question as to how exactly, again, this paradox that we've seen continues to play itself out in our case. How can it be that the very same se'ara, which represents God's divine justice, that somehow, paradoxically, as God appears to Iyyov in that way, through the se'ara, that somehow in that way, his problems are resolved? What a strange kind of notion, right? If anything, right, this should be the ultimate kind of exemplar of all the difficulties of Iyyov. After all, Iyyov is suffering. I don't understand. And God basically comes and throws midas hadin at him. But wait a second, Iyyov hasn't sinned. It doesn't seem that he's sinned. At least that's what he claims. That's what he insists throughout. And in fact, the end of the book indeed confirms that, affirms that as well. So how exactly does God's manifestation in a se'ara lead to a reconciliation between this righteous, suffering individual Iyyov on the one hand and the divine presence in the se'ara on the other? To understand, let's take a step back and let's take a look at the book of Iyyov as a whole. As we argued last time, it's through a larger understanding of the broader narrative arc of the book of Yechezkel we suggested last time that can teach us, can give us insight into the specific local symbolism of this se'ara. Let's take a simpler tack this time and take a look at the book of Iyyov and try to understand what exactly is happening in this particular story that allows us, that gives us greater insight into the specifics of God's later manifestation in the whirlwinds toward the end of the book. So, if we recall, the book of Iyyov is not only one of the most important works with regard to theodicy, with regard to tzaddik v'ralo, with regard to understanding God's ways and the suffering of the righteous. It's also one of the most difficult works in all of Tanakh. In fact, I once did an online poll and I asked a whole bunch of friends. I said, if I were to ask you off the bat, what's the most difficult book in all of Tanakh? Right down the line, I got Iyyov, 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 all the way through. Someone then chimed in and said, actually, I found Isaiah, I found Yeshayahu to be more difficult. Someone else, another friend of mine, chimed in with a big question mark. Really? Seriously? You think that's the most difficult book in Tanakh? I think it's Iyyov. And hands down, I would have to agree. The words in the book of Iyyov are exceedingly difficult. And that's why it's traditional. Traditional might be too strong. But many of those who learn Iyyov for the first time and encounter it tend to read, and understandably so, for good reason, just the very beginning and the end, the kind of the enveloping chapters or stories at the very outset of the narrative and at its very conclusion. Because the book of Iyyov is comprised of a total of 42 chapters, 42 prakim. The first two are the frame story at the beginning. The last is the frame story at the end. The 39 chapters in the middle are these nearly, sometimes it feels like at least, incomprehensibly difficult psukim on which you have to break your teeth and understand. It almost feels sometimes like a different dialect of biblical Hebrew than the rest of Tanakh. So with that in mind, let's just quickly review not only the story in terms of the frame at the beginning, at the end, but also let's try to summarize the conversations between Iyyov and his friends and the chapters that intervene in order to set up what in the world is happening toward the very end that allows the frame story to then return in the 42nd and final chapter of Iyyov, and can that give us insight into the theme of Se'ara as it manifests itself for the third time in this particular revelation, as we find toward the very end of the book of Iyyov. So to begin from the beginning, to start from Perek Aleph. So we recall the story essentially begins with this righteous man. He's a perfect Ishtam, the Yashar, Yizirei Elokim. He lives in this mythical town or perhaps historical town or city or area rather, I should say, in the land of Utz. Some say it's invented, it's merely a parable. Others say it is set in an area toward the east of modern-day Syria. Yet others say that, well, in fact, it's a metaphor, but there are realistic elements to it. But be that as it may, Iyyov is living in this land of Utz. He's a righteous individual. And then we quickly whisk ourselves away to, right, he has his children there with him, and his wife and everyone as well. They enjoy each other. There's company. There's a certain fraternity among the siblings. One family member each day or evening hosts a special party, and they rotate accordingly. Iyyov is concerned that lest his children have fallen short or sinned somehow, and so he offers sacrifices on their behalves. Then suddenly we're taken up into the heavens and we're given insight into the conversation between God and the angels, as well as the Satan. Now, who the satanic figure is and how he figures into the Jewish tradition is very difficult to know. But again, this divine prosecutor, make of him as you wish, says, okay, we know that Iyyov is righteous, but Iyyov has never been tested. He's incredibly wealthy. His family as well. God says, fine, go ahead. Let's see what he's made of. I'll allow you to do that, but you may not harm him personally. So then Iyyov loses so much. He loses pretty much everything. His children, his home, so much of his family. He's suffering, and yet he remains righteous. And that brings us to chapter 2. Chapter 2, Iyyov is remaining righteous, and we return to the scene in heaven. God says, see, Satan, as Satan arrives, I told you so, told you he would remain righteous. Satan says, no, that doesn't prove anything. Or ba'ad, or right, skin for skin. Ultimately, a person who is physically intact might be suffering, but ultimately can remain loyal to you. Take away his physical health and well-being, and you'll see he'll turn against you. Not a question. God finally exceeds, he acquiesces, he allows Satan to physically punish Iyyov as well. Iyyov nonetheless remains righteous. His wife says, just give up, go ahead and curse God. He refuses to do so. And so with that, Iyyov is suffering. He has seemingly retained his commitment to justice and righteousness. And at that moment, we have, the arrival of his three friends. And with this, we transition from the first two chapters, from the beginning of the frame story, or the frame story at the outset, to the actual body, to the actual poetic heart and soul of the book, which is these 39 chapters, beginning in chapter 3, running through chapter 41, with the series of dialogues between Iyyov and his friends. Now, Iyyov has these three friends, and you can remember the three friends in alphabetical order. The first is Eliphaz with an aleph. The second one is Bildad with a bet. And the third one, jumping to the letter Tzadi, is Sofar. Okay, and you have Eliphaz, Bildad, and Sofar, and they take up the bulk of the book with these exchanges. So in each set of exchanges, essentially what we have is in this alphabetical order. First, Eliphaz speaks, Iyyov responds. Then you have Bildad speaking, and Iyyov responds again. And then Sofar, the third time in the round, with the final set of comments by Iyyov, and then they begin again. This cycle continues, and this is where it gets extremely difficult. The commentators are wildly divided, and they're all over the place in terms of, does each friend have a consistent message, or are they within himself, or does each one represent or kind of convey a different idea? Right? So how do they relate to one another? How dynamic is this conversation? How do we summarize each stage in the conversation? What is going on? We're not going to attempt to discern all of this right now, of course. Suffice it to say that back and forth they go. And there are three rounds of conversation. The first two rounds essentially is all three friends speak it. Eliphaz, and then Iyyov responds and says, how dare you castigate me? How dare you accuse me? Bildad and Sofar, actually, as the dialogues continue, actually, the rhetoric ratchets up. Each time, at least certainly the first set of conversations, the first exchange, and certainly then in general in 2 and 3 versus the first set of exchanges between Iyyov and his friends, what we find is essentially is that things get more and more caustic. Things get more and more accusatory. Basically, the friends are insisting that Iyyov has sinned at some point, that how dare he go ahead and challenge God? And Iyyov responding, well, it's very nice that you think I've sinned, but I haven't. It's just factual. You just don't know me. Who are you to judge me? It's just not true. I wish God would appear and explain himself. I wish I could take God and bring him to a din Torah. I wish, speaking of justice and the theme of Seirah, I wish I could take him into essentially be in a courtroom with the accuser, and we can go and we can duke it out. And if I lose, I lose. No problem. But God has not even responded to me. He's not speaking to me. I can't understand what the divine will is in this case if I can't even hear God account for himself. And you friends, you think you're such great friends. They initially came, or you initially came, in order to comfort me. You sat there and you listened to me as I described my suffering. But as soon as I said even half a word about wondering about God's justice, it turns on me. You accused me. You called me a heretic. You called me a non-believer. You called me a bad person. You don't know anything about me. What kind of friends are you? And around and around and around they go. The first cycle is all three friends. Again, Eliphaz, Bildad, and Sofar. One speaks, Iyyov responds. The second round, again ratcheting up, as I said. Second round again, Eliphaz, Bildad, Sofar, and then the third round, they don't even have so much left to say. They've kind of been around enough. It's like two great fighters who are engaged in a boxing match or something like this, and back and forth they go. They're going 15 rounds. It's going for quite a long time, and you kind of get settled into the same patterns again and again and again. And here there's less for them to say. Eliphaz speaks a third time. Iyyov responds. Bildad speaks a third time, and again Iyyov responds. And at that point, it peters out, and Iyyov delivers in Perek Chav Zayin, in the conclusion, Chavchet, in the conclusion of this elongated set of dialogues. At this point, Iyyov responds, and everything is unresolved. Iyyov speaks in chapters 29 to 31, and that takes us to the end of this particular section. Now, having resolved essentially nothing and having things, we've got to think about it. This is a very long set of conversations, and this is something anyone who's on social media actually recognize this, but this is like social media. Everyone's just yelling at each other. Nothing is resolved. No one better understands anything or everything, anything about the world. All they've done is make themselves feel more and more recognized and heard by screaming at someone else. This is not going to get us anywhere. There is actually a fourth, either friend or individual, who suddenly comes out of nowhere. His name is Eliyahu, so another Aleph one. So you can kind of remember that way. And he takes up a series of chapters. He actually speaks for 6 chapters on and off between him and Iyyov. So again, everyone else was 1 or 2 chapters, and Iyyov would respond 1 or 2 chapters, and back and forth. Eliyahu has apparently been standing by the side. We don't hear a peep from Eliyahu until chapter 32 out of the 42 of the book. He is quiet. He says, I'm younger than all the other ones. And I was hesitant to talk. I thought Eliphaz would have something wise to say. I thought Bildad would explain. I thought Sofer would be able to weigh in and to persuade Iyyov as to how to understand the ways of God and not to be so demanding of the Almighty. It didn't work. So he says, I'm hesitant to weigh in. It's not my style. I'm younger than everyone. He says, but no one has said anything that's resolved anything. You're just screaming past each other. What a waste of everyone's time, he says. So therefore, he says, what I'm going to do is I'm going to instead now, I'm going to finally weigh in because everyone has said their piece and nothing has gone anywhere. So let me share my perspective. Eliyahu also speaks again for a long time. I'm not going to get into how his message is differentiated from that of the friends, but I will say that Iyyov is more receptive to Eliyahu's response, that he is more willing to consider what he says. And the words of Eliyahu seem to be a bridge between the chasm that had divided Iyyov on the one hand and his former friends, if you will, on the other, and that there was such a failed and weak attempt at dialogue that characterizes the first 30 some odd prakim of the body section of Sefer Iyyov, and Eliyahu begins to pave the way for God. God appears, and by the way, Eliyahu, in the last 2 chapters of his speech, Prakim Lamed Vav and Lamed Zayin, chapters 36 and 37, begins to emphasize the divine power, God's strength. Now, with this in mind, we can take a look at the words of God. And if you take a look at the source sheets, I began with God's first speech. Now, this is, of course, far from the first speech that we find in the book of Iyyov. It's chock full of speeches. All that's been happening are speeches. But of course, when God comes in, when God speaks, we listen. And it's a different kind of experience altogether. Yet the paradox, the irony of God's speech is that it is very hard to understand how it resolves anything in this world. Take a look at what God actually says. So, for example, again, there are many, many sections. I took some of the ones that are a little bit more accessible and also just took some snippets that are representative. So God opens and says as follows, Vaya'an Hashem et Iyyov. God responded to Iyyov, or he just spoke to Iyyov. The word Vaya'an appears throughout the book of Iyyov, not only as response in a dialogue, but just simply as a speech. We find that elsewhere in Tanakh. So Vaya'an Shem Iyyov minas se'ara vayomar. God responded, let's say, to Iyyov, or he spoke to Iyyov from the whirlwind, so the same phrase, from the se'ara, and he said as follows, Mize machshich etza demilin b'li da'at. Okay, so this is what we call a biblical insult, if you will. Okay, this is putting Iyyov in his place. Mizeh, who's this one? Machshich etza, who darkens wisdom. Okay, you don't want to be darkening wisdom, not recommended. Okay, so who is this one who's darkening wisdom, bimilin, with words, and that's all of Sefer Iyyov is milin, it's words, bilidat, without understanding. Okay, so you're darkening, you're sullying wisdom with words that lack understanding, lack intelligence. Ezornach gever chalatzecha, right? So gird yourself like a man, together, right? Like a man, chalatzecha. So, right, take your loins and gird yourself. This is how, throughout Tanakh, a warrior is described. Okay, you want to be a real man, he says, right? Men were the ones who, at that time in history, throughout much of history, were the ones who were the warrior, typically the warriors on the battlefield. There's some interesting exceptions in Tanakh, but they remain exceptions nonetheless. And so he says, gird yourself with your loins, become a warrior, right? Strengthen yourself, toughen yourself up like a man. I will ask you and tell me, right? Can you, right, grow up, stand up tall, and when God is present, let's see if you can still talk back to me and still have anything to say. And he says, why don't you tell me as follows? Evo hayita biosti aretz. Where were you when I established the earth? Right? In other words, God is gesturing toward creation. Where were you when I created this world, when I established the foundations of earth? Hagedim yadata vina. Tell me, do you have understanding as to how all of that went down, how all of that happened? Do you really understand the mechanisms, the inner workings of divine creation? Who are you to question me? Essentially, God seems to be saying, Mi sam mimadeha ki teda. Who placed its, okay, limdod means to measure. So who set forth or placed its measurements such that you would know? Were you the one who determined where the sea ends and where the land begins? Were you the one who determined the parameters of the universe, of Earth? Right? Nonsense. Right? You have Ominata Alehakad, right? Who is the one who literally made a line or extended a line over it? Alma Adoneha Hutbeu, right? Where, on what physical place where its bases, you could say, sunk, litvoas, to sink. So, right, we say in Az Yashir, right, to be'u suf, right, that the Egyptians and their chariots, the riders, they were drowned inside the Red Sea. They sunk in the sea. Omiyara Evan Pinata, who laid its cornerstone? Evan Pina. That's what we describe in Hallel. Those who had a chance to recite Hallel yesterday for Yom Yerushalayim. Those who will have a chance to recite Hallel tomorrow for Rosh Chodesh. And then, of course, on Shavuot, so relatively common these days. So Miyara Evan Pinata. So it's very similar to what we find toward the very end of Hallel, right? Lerosh Pina. Yeah, so this theme of a cornerstone, Biron Yachad Kochave Voker, Vayariu Kol Bnei Elokim. When the morning stars, and this is a beautiful, beautiful image. Biron Yachad, like from the word rina, to sing. So Biron Yachad Kochave Voker. It wasn't just that the morning stars were created, or even that they were visible as they emerged for the first time, but that they actually sang to the Almighty. And you can see in the translation, when the morning stars sang together, speaking of Hallel. Vayariu ko b'nei Elokim. And all the divine, or maybe it's Elohim, all the divine beings shouted for joy. Okay, like truah, so to pronounce a sound, produce a sound. Okay, so God is essentially challenging Iyyov here. And what's he saying? He's saying to Iyyov, he's saying, who are you? Right? You're being so presumptuous. Here you are, you've spent an entire book trying to challenge the Almighty, trying to say that divine justice is immoral. It's not just that it's incomprehensible, but that it's wrong. But who are you to judge? How can you possibly say anything about the justice of the universe without understanding the very first thing about the universe? Were you there when I determined its rules? Do you understand really how all of this comes together, how all of it works? Were you present to see the singing of the stars, who were implicitly then extending praise to the Almighty? The Kochavim understand, the Bnei Elokim understand. And Bnei Elokim, presumably, here is playing off the divine beings that were present in the frame story at the very beginning. Recall, God is not only talking to Satan, but God talks to Satan in the very beginning of the book in context of God's morning meeting, if you will, as it were, with the angels, and specifically uses the term B'nai Elohim. Much, and again, you could call it B'nai Elohim, meaning you can say that it's a reference to God, but regardless, these are great powers, angelic powers, divine powers, however you want to understand it. But this conversation now is hearkening back to that, right? Vayariu kol b'nei Elokim, those who shouted for joy at the very beginning of creation, who have some real meaningful insight into divine intention, presumably the design for creation as well, presumably including Satan himself as well. So they were all present. You weren't present, therefore you cannot begin to comprehend. You cannot begin to understand anything that is going on over here. Now, God continues and extends the conversation in this way throughout. Let's see just one more example. We could choose many. God, by the way, appears to Iyyov yet again from the whirlwind. And by the way, Iyyov's, maybe more than a by the way, Iyyov's response to God is he says, wow. He says, thank you, essentially. And he says, I have nothing to say in response. So here's Iyyov hearing this claim from God. He spent 40 chapters nearly, essentially responding the claims of his friend. Eliyahu jumps in, begins to speak about divine justice, and Iyyov is more hesitant to respond. And now it comes to God, and God says, who are you? He thunders to Iyyov, who are you to judge me? You know nothing about anything that's happening here. And Iyyov accepts. He is silent. And so God continues in chapter 40, Perek Mem, Pasuk Zayin. Again, these are just by way of example. We could study all of these chapters in depth, and you'd see very similar kinds of themes emerging. So here we find, by the way, I should mention also, God mentions in this context some of the great mythological beings that we find in Tanakh. Some of the fun, favorite, really exotic creatures appear in these chapters in Iyyov, because God is describing kind of the miracles of the time of creation, how you don't understand anything. So, for example, we have the Leviathan. The Leviathan, or the Livyatan, God says, I created the Leviathan. The Leviathan is even greater, I would say, than the Loch Ness monster. The Leviathan is the one who roams the seas. The Leviathan is the one who essentially terrorizes humanity. Leviathan, of course, then becomes the model for Moby Dick, right? You have right? You find a model for Moby Dick, although that in turn might come from the Loch Ness monster. But so these later myths are built layer upon layer, often ultimately going back to beings like the Leviathan, and it's no coincidence that we find elsewhere in Tanakh, such as we'll actually say on Rosh Chodesh, we'll see tomorrow the chapter 104 of Tehillim, and we discuss Livyatan. We describe Livyatan Zeyatzarti Lisachek Bo. God is again describing creation there in a less, I would say, thundering or judgmental context, and just describing the wonders and the beauties and the miracles of creation. So Livyatan Yatzarti Lisachek Bo. For us, the Leviathan is terrorizing. For God, we created it as a play buddy, right? It's a play date, as it were, for the Almighty. So that's the Leviathan. We also find the Behemoth. Behemoth, also a great mythical beast, a beast of the land, or debates whether the Behemoth is just a mythical being or actually is a hippopotamus. And the hippopotamus was indigenous actually to ancient Israel. And terrorized people at that time in ancient times. There's a lot of evidence about this from the biblical period. So some say it's the hippo, others say no, it's some other mythical beast. Maybe it's not an actual beast, but regardless, not surprisingly, in the context of God's gesturing toward the miracles and the terrors of creation, it's no surprise that animals and beasts such as the Leviathan and the Behemoth arise and are described in this context. Okay, with that, God then thunders forward and continues, and he describes or he exclaims, "Ezor nach gever chalatzecha." So he reiterates this idea, right? Right, gird your loins, be a man. Okay, let's see if you have the strength to handle this. El shalcha v'hodi'ini. Okay, so very, very similar. It's like essentially identical description. Ha'af tafer mishpati tarshi'eni leman titzdadak. Would you indeed annul my justice? Would you condemn me so that you might be right? It's like, who are you to judge me? The imzerah kakelach uvekol kamahu tzareim. You have an arm like God, you thunder with a voice like His. Who do you think you are? Right? You're not the Almighty. You're not the one who engaged in creation, and therefore you have no true insight into what ultimate justice looks like. Adena gaon velgova v'hodra hadar lil tilbash. Deck yourself out with grandeur and majesty. Clothe yourself with splendor and glory. Pour out the fury of your anger. Look at everyone who is proud. Bring him low. Bury them all in the dust together, bind their faces in the hidden place. Then even I will acknowledge to you that your own right hand can save you. In other words, God continues to challenge Iyyov and to declare that he's not the sort of man who has the right to stand up to God in that ability. Now, what's fascinating about this narrative, what's fascinating about God's response, is that, and so many commentators, many traditional as well as modern scholarly commentators have made this point, it's really hard to understand what God is trying to convey. If you think about it for just a moment, go back to the entire story, and if we were to examine more carefully and in greater depth all of the rounds of dialogue between Iyyov and his friends, Iyyov and Eliphaz, or Eliphaz and Iyyov, Bildad and Iyyov, Sophar and Iyyov, and again, and then the comments of Eliyahu, there really is nothing new here, right? It's true that God is the only one who can say from personal experience, obviously. Look, I created the world. Were you there? Obviously not. What do you know about this? That's fine. But note that God does not seem to be saying that everything is just or explaining why or how everything is just. He never responds directly to Iyyov's question. Iyyov said, I am purely righteous. I should not be punished. The friends say very often, well, you must have sinned. Otherwise, right, this is all nonsense. Obviously, you made a mistake. Or they say, well, what do you know about divine creation? What do you know about divine justice? They don't say creationist but although Eliyahu does. What do you know about divine justice? How are you in position to say anything about God that is negative, right? You shouldn't say any of this at all. Iyyov demands God's presence. Iyyov says, where are you? Right? Reveal yourself. I'm going to take you to court. Let's duke this out so that I can finally get an explanation. And God reveals himself. And what sort of explanation does he offer? None. He doesn't offer an explanation at all. In fact, it's hard to even understand how and in what way God is resolving anything at all. And it's so perplexing. Remember, I say, you've spent all of this time in tortured, almost pointless dialogue, going circle and circle and circle, round after round after round, until they exhaust all of the milin, all of the words that they have to offer. And then God comes and he says, much the same, yes, with the tone and tenor of his own, but he doesn't seem to answer Iyyov. And yet, Iyyov's final response, take a look at the last source on the sheet. In chapter 42, which, as we say, is the very last chapter of the book, we find the resolution of the story. Iyyov responds now and turns to God, and he says, Yodati ki kol tucha. Now I know that you are all capable. Lo yibater mimecha mezima. No plot, no plan of yours can ever be thwarted, can ever be detracted from you. Remember we said that the same word itzah that we saw earlier, right? Who is this one who hides counsel without knowledge? Says, these things are too wondrous for me. They're beyond my comprehension. And he acknowledges, remember, God had challenged him. We saw at the beginning of Perek Lamed Chet, the beginning of chapter 38, right? Gird yourself like a man. Hold up your loins. Pull them up. Respond to me. Tell me, right? I'll tell you, and you respond to me. You answer me. It's the very same language that Iyyov uses here as well. L'shema ozen shmaticha. Right? Ve'ata ini ra'ata. I'd heard you by ear until now. Now my eyes see you. Alkein em as v'nichamti. Therefore, I take it back. I'm disgusted with my initial comments, perhaps. V'nichamti. I've changed my mind. I've recanted or relented. Ala farba efer, because I am just dust and ashes. Iyyov acknowledges his limitations. Iyyov then, in the very conclusion of the book, is restored. Everything comes back. He comes back actually twofold. He's even more wealthy than he had. He has double the number of children. Everything is restored to him at the very end of the book. In fact, many have been so perplexed that they questioned it. Elie Wiesel, just to give an example, has a series of portraits of biblical characters, biblical messengers, he calls them. And the last of the chapters is about Iyyov. And of course, in many ways, the book of Iyyov echoes with it mirrors so many of the experiences that Elie Wiesel himself had endured over the course of his time in the camps. And Wiesel is very frank. He says Iyyov is an extraordinary book, and he explains why. And he talks about the incomprehensibility and the inability of anyone to possibly come and say words of comfort to Iyyov. If only, he says, they would listen and understand that his crisis of faith is not only real, but it's justified as well, and that we don't necessarily have the answers, and that's real, and that our only job, as he always would say, is to not remain complacent in the face of danger, but not to claim or imagine that we can understand its divine significance. He says that that's absurd after everything that he and 6 million of those who did not make it had, of course, endured. And so that's Wiesel's kind of, I would say, his very sympathetic and very receptive take of the majority of the book of Iyyov. But then he says, and he's very frank about it. He says, I almost wish as if the last couple of chapters were never written. I feel like it's all wrong. This is being very frank. And he just says, like, I just don't understand. God comes and God says, you idiot, you nincompoop, you little flea, you couldn't possibly understand any of this. Okay, that's true. That's fair. And Iyyov says, gosh, you're right. Right? And God says, oh, good. I'm glad you acknowledged that I'm right. Let me restore everything to you. Really, says Wiesel? Really? It's like, I wish Iyyov would have continued to thunder back. I missed the Iyyov in the first 37 chapters. Where was he? When he said back to everyone, he said, how dare you? You think you're more righteous than me? It could be, but it has nothing to do with my suffering. What kind of arrogance? What kind of intellectual it's almost this grotesque intellectualism about them, instead of acknowledging that you can't possibly understand and stop judging those who suffered so mightily. And I think that Wiesel's question is very profound and very powerful. And many, not just Elie Wiesel, far from it, have genuinely struggled very mightily to understand this appearance, this revelation of God, minas se'ara, from the whirlwind, what exactly is going on. But I think in light of what we said, we can at least begin to understand if not the resolution to the book, but why this is more meaningful somehow to Iyyov. Because I think, and again, we don't have time to obviously to read and analyze the book as a whole, but I think that one thing that we see, even in this last couple of psukim that I cited here, we can begin to see that it's not so much the substance of God's answer, or the resolution or explanation for his suffering, that I think that Iyyov is satisfied by and comes to appreciate, that resolves the story, but rather the very simple fact of the presence of God. Take a look at the language here in the second to last pasuk Hey, in the section of Parak Membet that we cited. He says, Lishema is Iyyov speaking now, responding to God. Lishema ozen shmaticha. To this point, I only heard by you, only heard from you, or only heard of you, but now, v'ata ini ra'atcha. My eye has actually seen you. And this, of course, takes place by way of the se'ara, by way of the whirlwind, which is the symbol of the manifestation of the revelation of God, just like we saw in the story of Eliyahu, and just like we saw in the story of Yechezkel. What Iyyov seems to be saying is that there's nothing about his intellectual understanding of his suffering that has changed. Wiesel was right. We can't understand. There is no accounting for it. Here's a righteous man who now has suffered. Call it a test. He doesn't understand that. That doesn't make sense to human beings, right? And none of that is what God explains or has explained to him. God has not come to answer to Iyyov and explain how the courtroom in heaven works. All Iyyov has been asking from God is challenging him is really two things. He does want an answer, and that he does not get. But what he also wants is simply for God to be present, for God to appear. Throughout the Sefer, from the beginning of his suffering, through all of the chapters, it is the friends who appear. It is the friends who come and say, what do you need God to show up for? Of course he's just. And Iyyov says, what do you mean? Of course I need God to show up. I need him to be here. I want to engage in a courtroom setting with the Almighty and with the trappings of justice and the themes and the motifs and symbolisms of justice that appear recurring throughout the book. God does not appear and answer Iyyov's questions because there is no answer that any human being could ever begin to comprehend, as Wiesel so poignantly not only said, but really exhibited and symbolized and was emblematic of throughout the course of his own lifetime, and as unfortunately we know from Jewish history throughout until the present day. But what God does do is that he appears, and he appears from the whirlwind. And if it's true that l'shema ozen shmaticha and denira atcha, that hearing about God's answer and hearing the answer from God, and as it were, seeing God in the flesh, again, whatever that means, but seeing some sort of divine manifestation and engaging in a relationship with the Almighty may not resolve any theological or intellectual questions. It does not grant Iyyov da'at, Eitzah, and Binah, insight, wisdom, understanding that he did not previously possess. But what it does do is it gives him a relationship. It gives him a connection with the Almighty. And so in this third case as well, we see that this se'ara represents not just divine justice, but actually the presence of the Almighty, a sort of a harsh yet softening, a harshness yet softening at the same time, paradoxically, once again, of God's presence. Once again, the se'ara represents the intensity of God's presence, and while God's presence, while God's words, rather, his message, the substance of his remarks to Iyyov are harsh, are painful, are very realistic, and basically say, get out. You cannot begin to comprehend. Nonetheless, it's the very presence of God, not just his words, not just l'shema within, but rather ra'o ra'atcha. They've actually come to see, or re'ini ra'atcha, my eyes have come to see you. It's that actual encounter that softens things and paves the way for the resolution rather, of the story of the book. And so ultimately, I think that there is a very profound paradox that speaks to us at this time of year. And I think it ties back to Matan Torah, to the events of the revelation at Har Sinai as well, the upcoming holiday of Shavuot. Of course, we know that when God appears to the Jewish people at Mount Sinai, it is overwhelming. We find this in particular in Sefer Dvarim, and there are many, many midrashim with which we are familiar that amplify this theme. God appears and the Jewish people are terrified. They beg, as we see in Parshat Va'etchanan and Sefer Dvarim, they beg, they entreat Moshe, please, you speak in front of God. Who can possibly see the fiery presence of the Almighty and survive? The rabbis tell us, building on these psukim, the same kind of theme, but dramatizing it. They say, God coerced the Jewish people to accept the Torah. They were so terrified they couldn't say no. They tell us that the Jewish people jumped back many, 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 many miles. They say that the Jewish people died, as it were, and needed to be resuscitated on multiple occasions until God and Moshe acquiesced to their request and was willing to convey the Ten Commandments secondhand. All of these themes really go back to the intensity of the divine presence that we find, to the Midat Hadin, to the divine justice that is represented by God's revelation in the Se'ara, if not literally, then very much along similar lines at Har Sinai. And yet we have seen that throughout Tanakh, we find kind of a softening. The presence of of Elisha rather, in place of Eliyahu. The presence of the divine message, not only in the Beit HaMikdash, but even on Har HaZeitun, even at the moment in exile. And finally, today, as we traced, the presence of God in the suffering of an individual to, if not answer our theological quandaries and our difficulties, but at least to give us a way to relate to the Almighty, to soften our pain and suffering, and ultimately to move on. And so I think there's a beautiful message here that I think we can take home with us as we head into the holiday of Shavuot. Sometimes when we actually feel some sort of spiritual experience, it can be overwhelming, it can be mighty, it can be crippling in a way. And we wouldn't have blamed Iyyov one moment if he would have heard the word of God, run away, fled like an Eliyahu to the desert, never to come back, never to continue in the remarkable, really miraculous, once not just in a lifetime, but once in a world history, perhaps, the example that Iyyov represents and that he conveys to us. And yet, at the same time, ultimately, God's presence reminds us that we have the ability to move on. We have the strength within us, not just as individuals, but as humanity, to realize that God's presence, while overawing, also is meant to be loving. It's also meant to be compassionate. It's also meant to give us the strength, to give us the spirit to ultimately soldier on. Of course, we find ourselves in difficult times. It's not only the revelation from God that makes it difficult sometimes to feel like we can continue, but it also is, of course, the difficulties that we are experiencing as individuals during a time of national suffering, as well as a people as a whole. And hopefully, the theme of the divine presence can inspire us to recognize that not only can we remain strong in the face of God's overawing power, but also that God's presence can also give us a degree of comfort, as we say, and as we learn from the book of Yechezkel, Imo Anochi Vitzara, that God is with us even at our most difficult of times. Thank you so much, and warm wishes for a Chag Sameach to all.
And to you too, Chag Sameach, and thank you so much, Rabbi Sinensky, and thank you to everyone who joined us today and is always part of our Dorisha learning community here. Sefer Azman is almost over, but this summer's classes include continuation of Rabbi Silber's class, The Covenant of Sinai, as well as Mishnah in Depth. So you can check for information and sign up at dorisha.org/classes. Thank you again for this full series, Rabbi Sinensky, and we will be together sooner than we expect, probably.
Thank you
Lehitraot.
so much.